I'm really pleased to welcome you to our fellowship event here tonight with University Professor Ruth DeFries. I appreciate each and every one of you coming to attend, and I'm sure we'll have some of the stragglers coming in after we've started. But I especially want to thank one of you, Emanuel Lichtenstein, college class of 1942, engineering class of 1943, who has rarely missed one of our events in as many years as I can remember. Manny, you're quite a guy.
Manny, how you doing?
As most of you know, ours is the not-for-profit society that was first organized in 1909 after Columbia moved to the Morningside Heights campus from Midtown, and that since 1949 has recognized deserving faculty at the college in engineering with its Great Teacher Award. This year's award event will again be held during Reunion Weekend on Saturday afternoon, June 1st, and I'm told registration information for Reunion Weekend will be sent out by the university in March. On a sad note, I've been told this morning that Peter Awn, Professor of Literature, Humanities, and Religion, Dean Emeritus of the School of General Studies, and recipient of the 1995 Great Teacher Award, died Sunday from injuries sustained when he was struck by a car in January. There'll be a memorial service on campus in the coming months, so I'm told. For the first time in our society's history, we will be videotaping tonight's invited talk so that it can be shared with many hundreds of our members and with the community at large. My special thanks to Professor DeFries for permitting us to do so. We're grateful and honored that University Professor Ruth DeFries agreed to speak with us this evening on the subject, Steps Toward Sustainable Development, Education, Research, and Impact. She came to Columbia in 2008 as the Denning Family Professor of Sustainable Development and was soon chair of the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology and co-chair of the undergraduate program in Sustainable Development. She's also chair of Columbia's faculty at the Earth Institute and director of Columbia's DeFries Lab, a multidisciplinary group that focuses on research that informs policies and decisions toward sustainable resource use. Professor DeFries' institutional leadership led to the creation of several innovative Earth Institute programs, and her public advocacy is responsible for advances around the world concerning climate change, food and water insecurity, and nature conservation. In 2016, she was appointed university professor, the highest rank Columbia bestows on its faculty. I believe at present there are only 9 professors with that title. President Bollinger referred to her as one of the world's foremost scholars investigating how to ensure a sustainable future for our planet. Prior to coming to Columbia, Dr. DeFries was a professor in geography and in the Earth System Science Center at the University of Maryland, on staff at the National Research Council with the Committee on Global Change, and taught at the Indian Institute of Technology in Mumbai. A sampling of her major honors and awards include election to the National Academy of Sciences, the American Association for Advancement of Science, the American Society of Arts and Science. She's a recipient of a MacArthur Foundation Genius Award, a Fulbright Fellowship, and honorary doctorate degrees from McGill University and the University of Leuven in Belgium. She received her PhD from the Department of Geography and Environmental Engineering at Johns Hopkins University, and her BA in Earth Science, summa cum laude, with election to Phi Beta Kappa from Washington University in St. Louis. Please join me in welcoming Ruth DeFries to the lectern.
Okay, well, thank you, Dan, for that very kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here this evening, and especially for keeping Columbia in your lives. It really is a very special place. And I'm sure that it has changed a lot since you were students there. I want to talk about the work that we're doing in sustainable development. Dan had suggested that I divide this talk partly about my own research and partly about the educational programs that we have at Columbia through the Earth Institute, which did not exist when you were at Columbia, I'm sure. And I think the most exciting aspect of my job, which I love, is working with the students at Columbia. And they just give optimism for the future in a world where we can be rather pessimistic. But, if you spend a few minutes with those students and see their passion and their engagement and how smart they are and how practical they are and how much they really want to make a difference in the world, it just makes us go on. So sustainable development has been in the lexicon for a few decades now. And what does it really mean? To me, it means that we think about any action that we take, using resources, growing food, building a dam, whatever way that we use our planet, we think about the impacts across not just the environment, not just across the economy, not just the social outcomes, but together. All three of those aspects together, the triple bottom line. I come from an interest in environment and moving over towards more of an interest towards sustainability, realizing that we cannot ignore the economics of any decision that we make. We cannot ignore the social consequences. We need to understand the way we use our resources and the way we live in this world and the kind of science that we do in terms of this triple bottom line. And this, from a science standpoint, is a very, very different way of thinking about science and organizing science. And that is really the reason for the Earth Institute. If we all stay in our individual departments, I'm in ecology, evolution, and environmental biology, so we come at things from the environmental ecology side. If we don't have a way to interact with our colleagues from economics or our colleagues from political science or our colleagues in another school in engineering or at the Mailman School of Public Health, then we can't fully understand the implications of the science that we're doing. So the Earth Institute's purpose is to foster that interdisciplinary kind of work and enable faculty and students from across the institution to work towards science and understanding that helps inform a sustainable world. So we have, as of a few years ago, countries around the world agreed on these 17 sustainable development goals. And there actually has been a lot of progress. I know it's easy to fall into doomsday thinking about the world, but I don't. I see the progress that has been made in the last couple of decades in reducing poverty. There's now less than 10% of the world's population that lives in extreme poverty, and just 2 decades ago, that number was something around 40%. So there's been really great progress in the world about many of these sustainable development goals. But there also are many aspects of these sustainable development goals which we need to work a lot harder on, and that has to do with climate, with maintaining biodiversity, with having healthy oceans, with social justice, with reducing inequalities. Many of these sustainable development goals need a lot more work. But these sustainable development goals do provide somewhat of a framework for the kind of work that we do and share and involve our students in thinking about how to move towards a world where some of these sustainable development goals will move closer to these goals. Many of them are aspirational, but we can move towards them. So I want to switch now and talk about how I take that kind of thinking about triple bottom line and interdisciplinary work into one topic that is currently my research topic, and it is about cereals in India. So many of you probably appreciate Indian food. It's very good, isn't it? And there are a lot of sustainability questions around food production, around our food systems. I work in India. It's a place that I care deeply about. I have a personal connection through my husband. It's a place I spend a lot of time, as much as possible. And I've watched over the last couple of decades how diets have been changing and how more processed food is getting into the diets. And just there's so much need for work on sustainability issues in India that that's really where I put my research focus at this time in my life. And what I've been working on, one of the aspects that I've been working on is this, the many sides of a roti. So a roti is the bread, like you see there, which is made from cereals. And cereals are a major portion of the diet and the calories that people consume. What has happened in India is a success story on one hand and a unfortunate on the other hand. The success story is the Green Revolution, the effort to increase yields of cereals was extremely successful. India is one of the success stories of the Green Revolution. So this was by using improved crop varieties, by increasing irrigation, by using fertilizers, the whole package that goes along with increasing yields. And this was very, very necessary from beginning in the 1960s. We see this very rapid increase in yields. And the great outcomes of that are that we no longer see the kinds of famines which occurred in India frequently and killed many people. Tragic. So Green Revolution gets a lot of criticism, but from my point of view, it was a success in terms of being able to feed an increasing population and providing more calories. So what happened during the Green Revolution was that rice and wheat, the two big cereals, those were the focus of the research, those were the focus of the investments, those were the cereals which increased. India, if you've traveled there or now in some of the restaurants, there's a variety of cereals which used to be more traditionally in the diet. We might trendily call them ancient grains. Sorghum, many kinds of millets, hundreds of kinds of millets that were more prominent in the diet. And what I've seen over the last couple of decades of spending a lot of time there is how those traditional cereals have disappeared out of diets. And you can see in terms of the production that they're a much smaller. Those are the C4. C4 and C3 is a physiological photosynthetic pathway of these cereals. I won't drag you into the details of that. But basically, the C4 cereals are adapted to the kinds of dry conditions there are in India. And the C3 cereals have increased a lot. It's been great for producing more calories, but the other cereals have reduced out of the diet. So here they are, wheat and rice, the commodities that feed a lot of the world, and the other cereals which have become less and less common in the production systems and in the diets as well. So, does it make sense to think about bringing those traditional cereals back into the diet, particularly since we know that India's food system is somewhat of a mirror, a magnified mirror of the global food system. So in our global and in India's food system, there's goods and bads. There are now abundant and inexpensive calories. That's a result of the Green Revolution, and there is certainly alleviation of periodic famines. We can all agree that that's good. But India in particular, the world in general, is facing this triple burden of diabetes and obesity is on the rise, very prevalent. India has more diabetics than anywhere else in the world. High prevalence of anemia and iron deficiency. Half of women and children are anemic. High prevalence of micronutrient deficiency, zinc and other nutrients. And still, despite the abundant and inexpensive calories, home to a fourth of the world's undernourished people who don't get enough calories. So there's plenty of issues to work on in the food system. There's also the environmental aspects, which I'm sure you've heard about, groundwater depletion, and with climate change, the extreme vulnerability of farmers to climate change. So do those traditional cereals improve the situation? We know that there has been, this is based on some consumption data that the government has collected over many years, that this is going in the wrong direction, that iron consumption, particularly for the rural poor, has been declining. That's not the way we want to think. That's not the way we want things to go. We want diets to improve, which they have in many parts of the world. But here we see a decline, particularly for the rural poor. So what's going on here is that rice is a particularly low, dense cereal. There's not a lot of micronutrients in the kind of white milled rice that people eat and the government distributes in India. And that has become more prevalent in the diet, and we see that because cereals are such a large proportion of the diet, we see the iron declining. So India has probably the biggest food safety network system in the world through a public distribution system where the government purchases rice and wheat from farmers and distributes it back to below poverty level households. So what comes out of that is that people are very dependent on what is distributed by the government, and the traditional cereals are not distributed by the government. So our focus is in thinking, does it make sense, considering multiple aspects of the costs and the environmental aspects, does it make sense to think about getting those traditional cereals available to people through this public distribution system or through other means? It's not obvious that it is, because those cereals are generally lower yield. But point being, and why I wanted to tell you about this part of my research, is because it typifies the way we think about research that we do in sustainable development. So we could only think about the water aspect. We could only think about the nutrition. We could only think about the climate, the greenhouse gas emissions. We could only think about the costs. But thinking about any one of those aspects alone is not sufficient when we're doing research in sustainability. We have to think about all of these dimensions together, which means we need to bring together a lot of different expertise. Nutritionists, climate scientists, hydrologists, agronomists, all kinds of expertise to try to get a whole picture. And if we are successful in what we want to do, which is provide science-based information which informs decisions which are positive for people and the planet, then we need to figure out a way to do this kind of interdisciplinary work and include all of the dimensions together. So just as an illustration, one of the aspects of this work is to ask the question, does it make sense to increase production of those traditional cereals that are well suited to the dry conditions? The problem with those cereals is their yields are low. Rice and wheat are so dominant because the yields are very high. You can produce more of them on a given area of land. So the last thing we'd want to do is promote increase in those traditional cereals and then have a calorie shortfall, have an overall production shortfall. That would make no sense at all. So we've been doing some work. I've been doing this with a postdoc and a group of people from an interdisciplinary group to ask this question. if we increase production in certain places of these different cereals while keeping the overall calorie production constant and the overall cropped area constant, because we don't want to, well, there isn't land available in India to increase the cropped area. So keeping those things constant, would it be possible to produce enough to feed the country? And how would that affect all of those different aspects? How much iron is produced? How much water is used? These are water efficient cereals. How much greenhouse gases would be emitted? How much climate resilience? These are, traditional cereals are climate resilient, less prone to lower yields during drought times because they evolved in this kind of system. That's what a C4 cereal plant does. So I'm not going to take you into all the details of the numbers here, but this work has involved a lot of modeling around a lot of different aspects to try to see if we tried to produce as much iron as we can, or if we tried to use as least water as possible, if we tried to minimize the greenhouse gas production. Rice produces methane, so it produces a lot of greenhouse gases. If we tried all these across all of these different dimensions, the point being that we want to look across all dimensions, does it make sense to think about increasing production of these other cereals and getting those into the public distribution system, or somehow promoting that people consume them more? And the answer is that it rarely happens that you have a lot of aspects that work in the same direction, but in this case, it is mostly win-wins. We can produce more iron and use less water and produce less greenhouse gases and keep overall production the same. So this is a kind of work that we're trying to understand as an example of interdisciplinary work that we do in the Earth Institute and that we need to do to help with science-based decisions for sustainable development. But this work only really matters if there's a way that we can communicate it and a way that we can get it into the knowledge base of decision makers. So it's so important, and I hammer this with my students who work internationally, that we need to have the right collaborators. So we can do all the research in the world on the Morningside campus or up at Lamont or in the Earth Institute and publish papers. But if we don't have the collaborations and the links with the people who can make use of the information, then the work just stays in published papers and doesn't, it might be good for CVs and promotions, but it doesn't really get at our target, which is making a difference and helping with science-based decisions that get us to a more sustainable use of our resources. So some wonderful collaborators who have great ways to communicate with the planning agencies and the decision makers who can take this kind of information into account. So that's really key for the kind of work we do in the Earth Institute, is to be able to link with those who can use the information that we can generate and work with them to understand what the important questions and problems are. So that was just a little example of one of my research projects. I worked on other projects throughout the years, deforestation in the Amazon and fires in Indonesia related to air quality, different kinds of issues. But the common thread of them all is that they're related to land use, how we use the land to produce food and resources that people need, and have some interdisciplinary aspect that we're looking across multiple dimensions, which is really the heart of sustainable development, which is about interdisciplinary work. So this, as you can imagine, this interdisciplinary thinking about sustainable development doesn't really match very well with the typical structure of universities, Columbia included, and the typical kinds of education programs and the kinds of majors that students might pursue. They might pursue biology, or they might pursue economics, or they might pursue political science, or in a department. What we're trying to do with our education programs in the Earth Institute is to cut across all of that and provide students with this kind of interdisciplinary base that they can take with them wherever they might go in the future, whether it's academics or private sector or wherever they might go. So I came to Columbia, as Dan said, in 2008, and one of the job descriptions, and I was really excited about it, was to develop an undergraduate program in sustainable development. It had started a little bit, but we worked hard to expand it. That program is now one of the top majors in Columbia College. We have a lot of we have a lot of general studies students as well in the program. That's why it's just so tragic, the news about Peter. What we try to provide with the students is this kind of understanding that natural science is important. They need that base. Social science is important. They need that base. Economics is important. They need to at least know enough about these different areas to know what they don't know. So it's a breadth versus depth. And we try to provide them depth, but also enough breadth so that when they leave us, they can have a basis for finding the right collaborators, knowing what the fields are that they need to interact with, to understand that every problem that they face will involve not just them, but working together with people in maybe very, very different areas than if they had just majored in a single discipline. So in the Earth Institute, this is our mission statement, to blend physical and social sciences, education, and practical solutions. That's where the collaborators come in to help guide the world onto a path towards sustainability. So that's our mission, and I want to talk now about the education part of it, our wonderful students. So in the Earth Institute, I work with the undergraduate program in sustainable development, but that's certainly not the only program by any stretch that we have in the Earth Institute. There's a number of master's programs. Several of them are in SIPA, the School of International Policy Affairs, Public Affairs. You got that wrong? There's some that are come out of Earth and Environmental Sciences, some that come out of Lamont, and there's a PhD program in sustainable development as well. So there's a lot of students that are coming out of these programs. And I, as I said, work most closely with the undergraduate program and get to know these students, which is really a delight. I brought some brochures, so there's a brochure on the table for the undergraduate program specifically, and all of the educational programs in environment and sustainable development, 2 separate brochures that are back there on the table. In the undergraduate program, we're trying to get across the message that the world is a complicated and messy place, and a complex place, and they need a good basis for both natural science and social science. So they need to take a foundation in both. They need to know enough about the natural sciences and know enough about the social sciences to see how they fit together. And we have the core of the program, which is about, we call them complex systems. So they'll think about water from, for instance, from a natural science perspective and from an economic, policy, and social perspective. Or they might we'll have a class on energy where they'll think about the multiple perspectives. So we're trying to build that interdisciplinary thinking right into the core of the program. And we come at it thinking that it's so different than the kinds of education that we have. The students are just right there. It just seems normal to them. They just don't even question that, that you wouldn't think about any one of these problems, water, energy, food, climate, any of these issues in a kind of interdisciplinary way. So I love them for that, among the many reasons. We try to get them off campus as much as possible. We're very cognizant that they need to, if they do a study abroad, a semester abroad, then we work with them to fit that in their curriculum. We try to provide the opportunities for engaging in research, and particularly for off-campus experiences, because I firmly believe in field work. You can learn so much more by being in the field, being somewhere, being in India or wherever for one day than you'll learn for an entire semester sitting in a class. So I'm a big proponent for getting the students out into the real world. So where do our students go from the undergraduate program? Last year we celebrated our 10-year anniversary of the program, and so we put together a lot of statistics. You can see that a lot of the students are going into the private sector, and we think that's fantastic, and we will help them get there as much as we can, but they help themselves more than we help them. A lot of the students are interested in going into the sustainability offices that a lot of companies have. We have students that have gone, there's a list there that I'm sure you can't see, I can't even see that, have gone into Unilever or Walmart, or working with the private sector, and that's really great because that's where change is going to happen. Many of our students go into public service, maybe with the New York City or state government or federal government, some agency, or into working with non-governmental organizations. Some of them have gone into some environmental NGOs. So we try to help them be prepared for whether they choose to go into the private sector or into the public sector, to take that kind of interdisciplinary base and bring that with them to be able to deal with the messy problems that they will face, because all of our problems in the world are very, very messy. Some of them do go into graduate studies, some have gone to law, some have gone to medicine, some have gone into physics and science, and some go on to graduate school in other areas. But we're certainly trying to help them find where their comfort level is, where they want to go, and then how to get there. And we think that the employers appreciate the training that they're getting. So I know you can't read this. This is the list of all the graduates that we've had from the undergraduate program. And this is what really gets me up in the morning, is to think about all of the ways that these students, when they leave us and even while they're here, all of the amazing things that they do. Some of them have started their own NGOs for building schools in Africa, or have just done these incredible things. And we work hard to try to keep track of them and try to keep them engaged, and they are really the bright spot, and they are provide a lot of optimism, because they're not being despondent and doomsday and thinking it's the end of the world. They see that there's some really hard problems out there, and they need to be prepared to work on them, and they want to work on them, and they want to make a difference. So we thoroughly enjoy working with these students. So that was a mix, a little bit of research and a little bit about the education program, particularly the undergraduate program, but I could equally, I'm most engaged with the undergraduate program, but similar stories can be told about all of the educational programs we have at the Earth Institute. And so we can discuss questions, comments, thoughts from you.
That was great, thank you. You emphasized the right collaborators, and from what I've read and experienced, resistance to change, cultural issues are the toughest ones.
Yes.
After you solve everything else. Are they just the right people, or is there training that you provide in your undergraduate and graduate classes for how to approach a political system and a cultural system and induce it to change?
Yeah. So I teach a class in particular where I really try to work on exactly that question. That if you're working internationally, for example, to engage, to engage over the long term, you can't really have an impact if you just swoop in and think you have the answer. And I learned this working on deforestation in Brazil, to just come in from the outside and this is the answer, this is what I think you should do. That's really not going to get you very far, especially in the world we live in today. So to have a real impact in a place requires long-term engagement, requires understanding the culture, respecting the culture, and working together, truly working together, and leaving aside a notion that we know better than someone else who is actually from the place and understands the place. So I feel I certainly learn. I'm sure I learn more from my collaborators than they learn from me.
So first, again, I want to compliment you on the interdisciplinary approach. It is so important, and something that Columbia does so well. It's great to see. But I'd also like to go back to the first part of your presentation about the grain. And I'm going to challenge you on that a little bit. I was not aware of the iron deficiency or the micronutrient deficiency, but I was aware of the rise in diabetes type 2. And again, I'm not an expert, I'm not a scientist in that, so I know what I read in the press. And what that's attributed to largely is the cultural changes through the growth of the middle class, that people are abandoning the legacy diet and starting to eat like Americans. And there's a lot of data that says that's happening in other countries in the world too. People are giving up home cooking and eating cheeseburgers and white bread buns. So my question to you is, even if you, and by the way, your data that showed affluent people, both urban and rural, had the highest rate of decline, they had the greatest diet choice. So my question to you is, even if you were to create the perfect solution on the grains, would that have an effect?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that this rise in obesity and diabetes and this non-chronic diseases, diet-related non-chronic diseases, that we're seeing rise everywhere around the world. India is one example, but everywhere around the world is such a enormous issue for society. Leave aside climate and all the other issues. It's just such a big personal, burden for health and for societies at large with healthcare costs and what do you do with the population that has these non-chronic health problems. India is a very interesting case. In general, the diets haven't really shifted they've shifted towards a Western diet in the sense of more processed food, definitely more processed food. I mean, potato chips and junk like that. So that is definitely not a good trend as far as I can, in my way of thinking. Some people will like that, and I've learned, boy have I learned, not to try to tell people what they should eat. So the last thing you should do is try to tell people what they should eat, because it's such a personal decision. The increase in diabetes seems to be, now there's a lot of research that needs to be done, seems to be related to this increase in consumption of white rice, because white rice has a high glycemic index. Seems to be. It's still unclear how much more sedentary lifestyles or dietary changes affect diabetes. But now it's becoming very trendy in India to eat those other cereals because they're supposed to be better for diabetics. So irony of all ironies, what used to be what poor people eat is now nicely packaged and expensive in fancy grocery stores, and the urban elite is eating those because of the health benefit over eating white rice.
Thank you.
You mentioned that there's a lot more processed foods being eaten. And years ago, there was a study out of CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania Hospital, in which one single piece of data predicted childhood anemia in the poor section surrounding CHOP. And that was, if you went into the home and opened the food storage units, was there stuff to cook?
Yep.
It was just that. It didn't matter what it was. meat, fish, vegetables, as opposed to cans, frozen TV dinners. That one thing predicted anemia in the household. It predates the type 2 diabetes epidemic, especially in children. It was 100 years ago. But that's all it took, is that one piece of data.
And you think about as lifestyles become more hectic and people look more towards convenience. And Americanized, and those opportunities. The food environment is so important that those kinds of processed foods are more available and they're cheap.
Yeah, that was another part of that study. If you lived in one of those areas around Philadelphia, a long way from India, but if you lived in one of those areas, in a poor area, and you needed to feed a family of 4 on a very, very low income, the way you would get calories for little money would be to buy garbage foods that were processed. Whereas if you lived in suburban Philly, in a wealthy area, and you wanted to maximize calories, the processed foods were expensive foods, and you would actually be more economically sound to buy fresh vegetables and meat and so on, to not go down the processed aisle.
Yep. Our food system, I mean, it's one of the topics we know in the Earth Institute is really, really important for us, is the global food system and however it plays out in different places around the world. But it's the same story everywhere. Increase in processed food consumption, increase in obesity and diabetes.
And also just look at sodas, Coca-Cola, all the soft drink marketing, all the sugar consumption that is being promoted, and somehow corporate America has made a tremendous impact throughout the world. And sugar consumption per se is just skyrocketing.
Yep.
Maybe we have to learn from their marketing.
Yeah, well, the changes, the most prevalent changes in diets around the world is the increase in sugar consumption and increase in vegetable oils. So those two things together have certainly contributed to the epidemic of obesity and diabetes. There's also increase in animal product consumption. That's a very known trend, that as incomes increase, then consumption of animal products increases, dairy and meat. And we tend to think in this country, we hear a lot about not eating meat and how bad it is. And we certainly in this country consume way more protein than we need, and more definitely could benefit from cutting back. And in fact, red meat consumption has declined. But in some parts of the world, like in India, for example, some animal products in diets is actually quite beneficial. This is what I've learned from my nutrition colleagues, a couple of eggs, more milk, maybe some meat once in a while, because the diets are so cereal-based that that story that we hear that is true in this country, that we eat too much animal foods, doesn't really apply.
You commented in passing that rice produces more methane. Could you just expand on that a bit?
So rice paddy is basically flooded, a flooded field to grow rice, as you see throughout Asia and other places. And when there's waterlogged conditions, those anaerobic conditions without oxygen, that's where we get methane production. So methane comes from wetlands, comes from landfills, comes from ruminant animals' guts. Those are all anaerobic environments, and that's where the methane comes from.
How big an issue is that? Because we've all heard about cows, okay?
From Bill Gates. Yes.
Yes, okay? But is the methane from rice production significant in terms of its contribution to methane on the atmosphere, or it's just it happens, but it's not a big deal?
It is. I would have to look up the precise number, but agriculture in general, that would be the methane production and the greenhouse gases from machinery and clearing for agricultural land. All of the sources of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture accounts for about a quarter of all anthropogenic emissions. So it's not the big elephant in the room in terms of emissions is the energy sector, but agriculture does contribute quite a chunk. And for some countries in particular, their methane emissions from rice production would be a major portion of their emissions. There are some efforts, dry rice, grow without, so you don't have that anaerobic environment that would produce less methane emissions. And the other aspect of methane is that it is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas, many times more powerful than a carbon dioxide molecule. So we want to keep the methane out of the atmosphere.
When you refer to agriculture, are you including livestock or just?
Yeah,
You are
yeah,
including livestock.
yeah. It's about a quarter globally.
You had indicated earlier that some of your students are going into private industry, into sustainability groups.
Mhm.
Are you finding that a lot of companies are setting up these groups, and if so, how are they utilizing them in their business model? Are they looking to upgrade their own business, or are they basically using it, let's say, for the facilities that they operate?
Yes, so over the 10 years of the program, this has changed a lot. That the private sector has set up, more and more companies have set up these sustainability offices. And a lot of that has to do with their supply chains. So Unilever was a leader in this area, and it's also because some of the pressure that's been put on the companies from NGOs about cleaning up their supply chain towards ensuring that there aren't products that they're using that's coming from deforested land, or there's also, social aspects to it as well. So looking at their entire supply chain, and this has become more and more a reputational issue for companies such as Walmart. So I was at a tour of Walmart has actually really paid attention to their supply chain. I know they get pinged a lot for their labor issues, but they have absolutely been serious about the environmental aspects of their supply chain, working with farmers to use less nitrogen emissions, for example, nitrogen fertilizer. So I was in Walmart. I was on a tour of a Walmart store in Arkansas, Bentonville, Arkansas, the headquarters of Walmart. And we were looking at all of their sustainability aspects. And we went to the seafood aisle. So they have a sustainable seafood part of their sustainability program. And who is there giving us the tour but one of our very own graduates. So it was a great moment. And that's the kind of work that these students are doing. I mean, it's mostly about the supply chain. So we try to have classes where we help them with tools that allow for them to analyze supply chains and analyze the environmental, social impacts and the whole sustainability of the whole system that a company might be interested in.
I'm struck by, you said that it's an interdisciplinary program, but it's also, it's related when you put up the graduates and the undergraduates. It's the graduates who are out with that education, educating others, because if the scientists come up, the physical scientists come up with a solution, you have to have public policy, or you have to have, the private sector has to say, well, we're going to do this. Yeah, as you said, you can't just impose it on people other than regulatory. And ESG investing is a big reason why Unilever cleaned up their supply chain. It isn't because they said, gee, let's do this. They did it because investors said to them, if you don't do it, we're going to stop investing in you, your stock and your securities. So it's almost like it's organic. It sort of grows between the students and graduates or people who understand it, who are already out in the public and private sector.
Yep. And I think that the employers, we've heard from Unilever in particular, has hired a lot of our students, that they do appreciate that kind of breadth that these students have. Now, we're always struggling between that breadth versus depth question, because you could be a mile wide and an inch deep. So what we aim is some depth. You can't be an expert in everything, but to have depth in some area, but an appreciation for the breadth that is required, as you say, if you're coming from a physical science side, to know that there's a whole aspect of policy and economics that you might not be expert in, but you better find somebody who is.
That's very interesting.
What percent of your undergraduates in your program come to Columbia with this major in mind? And then when do the others find you?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. We don't know the answer to that question in numbers. We do hear from them sometimes that they did come to Columbia because of the Sustainable Development Program, but we don't really have hard numbers on. I guess we could from the admissions office, because they list what they're interested in and how many of those actually end up majoring in sustainable development and how many came in afterwards. They don't declare, as I'm sure you know, Columbia is different than a lot of other universities because of the core, the wonderful core, and because they declare their major a little further on. So sophomores would be the earliest when they would be declaring. We do have the students started their own Student Union for Sustainable Development, SOCG, and they do a lot of outreach, because we don't really get the students until they declare. We don't know. But the Student Union has a way of reaching out to students who have not yet declared.
Do you have any piece at all in the core curriculum? Is there a representation of this type of thinking in the core curriculum? And the core curriculum is already a very broad, but it's philosophically not similar to what you're talking
Yes.
about, at least not when I'm.
There was one aspect, there is a, in the writing, so all the students have to take the writing part, and there was, I don't know if it still is, a sustainability focus to that. That was the theme, was sustainability, and we did hear from several students that that's what brought them in. There's also,
just to have a sense of what it all means.
Yeah, there's also Frontiers of Science, which probably didn't, I know it didn't exist. And in Frontiers of Science, there's some elements of climate or biodiversity, different aspects that are important for sustainability, so that might get them interested also. But there isn't, you're right, there isn't a core class on sustainability.
Well, it doesn't have to necessarily attract. My motivation wasn't necessarily to try to attract more people into the field as much as to educate more people that there is such a field and what that field does. Just, it's always offended me that in many different areas, introduction to blank is somehow used as a way of weeding out people who were thinking of majoring in blank.
Sounds like you were pre-med.
Well, my son was, but
my daughter was too.
But it seems to me that if you're a Columbia student, you ought to be able to take introduction to anything. Doesn't mean you have to go into it, but just because you're a French literature major doesn't mean you can't know something about physics or sustainability or economics.
Yeah. We do have, as part of our program, a one-credit introduction to sustainable development, which is exactly that, just what's this about? And we offer that so students can get a little taste and see if it's something they're interested in majoring or not. If they don't, then they have that kind of just understanding that there is such a thing out there.
Because they're going to invest. I mean, whatever they do, they're going to buy a stock.
Yes,
We have a couple more questions.
Just one, in the undergraduate level, how much science is involved, and what degree do you get to get a BS, a BA?
So they, so in our program, I think that having some natural science base is important. So they have to take some sequence. They have to take 2 semesters of biology or 2 semesters of chemistry, or some. We have a whole list of the way that they can fulfill that natural science requirement. Some of them might not like that, but I think it's as important for them to have that kind of foundation as it is to also have a social science foundation, which some of the students who are more interested in the natural science part might wonder why they have to take social science, but they have to do it both. That's the whole point.
In your opening diagram, which is quite interesting, it seemed to imply that you really, that's what I was thinking of, yes. That actually, in each of these activities, there's an inevitable conflict to achieve some sustainable goal. And someone has to, well, that's to be a function, at least, of resolving these conflicts, going the middle way instead of all the way, and so on. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. That you kind of hit it on the head of what sustainable development is all about. It's not necessarily the case that environment and economics will conflict. It may, that there's a trade-off between the two. It may be the other way. Take, for example, we were talking before about energy efficiency. So energy efficiency would be good for the environment and may also save money. So there's a case of a win-win. I think the cereals in India are pretty much of a win-win because you'd have better nutrition. From a social side, you'd have better nutrition, and you'd also reduce greenhouse gases and use less water and all kinds of good environmental benefits. So it's those kinds of solutions where there's a win-win, or at least not a hard trade-off, that is kind of the low-hanging fruit for what makes would be a great solution. That's not very common. The most common situation would be that there's some kind of trade-off. The reason why the world is unsustainable like it is because we don't factor in those trade-offs into our decision-making. We might just go for the economic benefit, or just the environment benefit, or just the social benefit. And the research that we're trying to do is to understand that whole picture as an input to decisions. Got it.
I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
Given the view that you must have internationally about what's going on in these areas, could you kind of paint a picture for us? Are there any places in the world that are forming their own Earth Institutes, or are your students going back to certain countries, and are those countries standing up some kind of organizations? Where would you say most of the work is going on?
In terms of education? Or
Both education and research, and trying to work interdisciplinary ways to solve problems.
So in the developing world, which is where I've worked mostly, there's a lot of work to do on educational programs. There's a lot, well, I'm just thinking about the India example and some other examples I can think of where curriculum is very sort of outdated, shall we say. So some of the students will go back and work at that. I had one particular student who was interested in going back to her home country, which was Kenya or Rwanda. No, it was Ethiopia, and working on the educational curriculum at all levels. So it's a slow process, but it might get there. But the educational system that's appropriate for each place is, we can't just export our program and think that it would be appropriate for some other place. It's really, if it's going to be successful, it would be based around the problems of that particular place and the culture of that particular place to be successful in the long run.
Let me narrow it to, what about in the developed world? Western Europe, Japan, China, they've got global corporations too that have
Yeah.
supply chains and so forth.
Yeah, I think
Is
in
this
Europe,
going on in Europe?
yeah, definitely. I would say definitely there's a lot of movement towards educational programs that are more interdisciplinary, recognize the hard problems that we have in the world. So, no, we're not alone.
Good to know.
Yeah.
It's a big world.
And there's also educational material. There's some online material that different faculty have done that could be useful. But again, if something's going to be successful, really, from an educational point of view, it needs to be grounded in the culture of the place.
Well, I really thank you for a good 30 minutes of Q&A. That's a record as far as I'm concerned. So you've obviously got...
Okay, thank you. Okay, all right. Thank you so much. Thank you.